Hello everybody, Pinstripe here. What is going on with you? Welcome back to the Hogshead podcast here on episode 3. I can already hear Gabe Knowles saying that in the back of my mind because, well, the word 3 and episode in the same sentence are a little bit tainted. We've got a lot to talk about today. A lot has come to light as of recently. If you listen to the Retro Hour podcast, you will have seen and indeed heard that there was an interview done with Jacob Habgood, who, as we know, was one of the lead programmers on Hogs of War and assisted greatly with its development. So we're going to be listening to a bunch of clips from that and just talking about basically everything he says, because we finally have some instances of like behind the scenes stuff, with how the project went, with certain themes, inspirations, game design, overall development, multiplayer, sound, voice acting, animation, marketing, all the stuff you'd expect to see from behind the scenes in a games industry and a game company such as Gremlins and Infogrames. And as many of you guys know, as I mention it quite often, there is very little info online to do with the development of Hogs of War as a whole. That goes for just the whole project, the behind the scenes stuff. There is some literature about, I believe, that talks about the level design in Hogs of War, or just the basic designs of things. So like pig ranks and upgrades and stuff like that. The game mechanics that we know from today's game. But other than that, it's just unknown. And that is also including stuff like the sequel, Hogs of War 2. And basically, what is the story behind that? There was information that it was because Infogrames went bankrupt. There was basically all revolving money and a lack of investment as well. But this podcast and this interview certainly puts a spotlight on those things that we've basically had for a long time, all these burning questions that have been around for so long from a lot of people in the Hogs of War community, regardless of how old you may be, if you're new to the game, if you just discovered it, if you're an old veteran who's played it since it came out. It answers a lot of questions, and it's pretty awesome to see as well, because we learn a lot from it. So I've decided to cut up the interview to break it down a little bit more into sections, so it gives us more talking points. So we're going to start with the game themes and inspiration. Where did the setting come from and the overall theme of the game? What were its inspirations? What can you really compare it to? All those kind of questions. So we're going to kick it off with that.
Well, before Hogs of War, were you guys playing a lot of Worms or into games like Worms Armageddon, which was quite big at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Scorched Earth as well. So, I think often people, and I'm sure it's going to come up, people say that Hogs of War is Worms in 3D. And, that's kind of what it is. But people forget sometimes that Worms itself has, forerunners, and that kind of game mechanic was established many years earlier than Worms itself.
Well, why did they choose World War I as a setting?
I guess, we thought that there was a lot of scope there for sort of black humor. And, we were very much into Blackadder and felt that there was a sort of trench humor that could work really well and be quite cynical about the war. And we liked that as a sort of setting for the game.
Because Gremlin had that kind of feel of European gaming before with stuff like Zool, and this title felt very British with the kind of Blackadder connection and having Monty Python's theme tune as actually in the game. How did you get that licensed, or was it free to use?
So the Monty Python theme tune is actually a historical piece of music, so it's completely out of copyright. So I actually put it in the game without any permission to begin with because I thought it fitted. And then when they saw it in marketing, they said, yeah, this is really good. And they were even more pleased when they realized they didn't have to pay any copyright.
Well, how did the idea of pigs come around? Pigs of War, like Black Sabbath? Or?
No, I think Aid Carlos, the designer, probably, was more into that kind of thing. But I mean, the story goes, and I have to sort of say that Ian Stewart does dispute this. So Ian Stewart, the guy who set up Gremlin, the story goes that Ian Stewart went to see Babe, and in a marketing meeting after having seen Babe, he said, well, we really need to be making games about pigs. People like pigs. So, they were looking at what games were doing well in the charts in those days. And it was actually Command and Conquer not Worms, that inspired Hogs of War. So the original concept, that we had a 2-page document written by Ed Carlos, who was the designer on Zool as well. It sort of sets out this idea for a game which is basically command and conquer with pigs.
So several major talking points from that first clip there, and I think the main one that a lot of people will relate to the most is the comparison to Worms. I think every Hogs of War player and fan will have at some point had some form of overshadowing whereby they're speaking to someone else who isn't necessarily that big of a fan of the game, but they know of it by name, and the comparison to Worms always comes up. Worms 3D didn't come out till 3 years after Hogs of War was released, and the idea of a team of 4 characters in a strategy, like 3D strategy game, was nothing new. And I guess the comparison happens a lot because at the time Worms could only really be compared to Hogs of War because they were both around the same theme. They had fairly similar weapons, but I mean, Hogs of War tried to stay away from the crazier ones like donkeys and grandma. You know, they go on to talk about that in a second, but the idea that Hogs of War stems more from Command and Conquer than it does from Worms is pretty cool, and it would be nice to see that GTD of that 2-page document that talks about that idea of Hogs of War in that format, where it's not a third-person strategy shooter, it's more of a top-down, move your units kind of game, you know?
Well, you know, speaking of like that World War I theme, there's one thing about the game is the weapons were realistic. It didn't go down the Worms route of like, you know, donkeys and grandma and that kind of thing. Was that a decision that you made early on, or?
Yeah, I mean, we were very conscious that we would be compared with Worms. But so we did, you know, try and keep some distance between what they were doing and what we were doing. I mean, when the game was being developed, we were always worried that they might come out with Worms 3D before we came out with Hogs. But I think we read a newspaper article at the time that said, well, no, they've given up on Worms 3D. It couldn't be done. They were sticking to 2D versions of the game. So at that point, we felt, well, okay, we've got a chance here to kind of make our own space a little bit with the 3D version.
Well, I thought the level design was fantastic, and the way that it was kind of like a voxel landscape, but it seemed like Populous on a much larger chunk. How did you think of the designs and kind of come up with that stuff?
So, I mean, the game engine itself was based around that landscape. I mean, you know, everything we were trying to do with it was give a very long view distance so that players could kind of have these sniper shots going all the way across the level. But the level designs themselves, I mean, were done by a number of artists over the course of the project, but it was really when Phil Wilson took over and sort of put those levels into shape. And Phil Wilson actually went on to be the producer on the original Crackdown. So, you know, he sort of started creating levels for Hogs of War.
And draw distance on the PlayStation then as well wasn't amazingly good, so it's good to have that
yes,
kind of range.
It was a complete nightmare, and getting the performance out of the PlayStation 1. I know, you know, even in its day, it didn't look that great. But the number of polygons we were throwing about, you know, I have had some compliments from other programmers who've stuck it through a PlayStation 1 profiler and gone, wow, you were throwing some polygons at the system there. But yeah, as a result, it meant we had to restrict the number of polygons in the pigs, and, you know, the number of players on the level just to make that work.
In previous videos, I touched on the idea of the logistics of a game and the more complex stuff that goes on behind the scenes, the actual physical making of it. A lot of Hogs of War, in fact the majority of Hogs of War, was programmed so it could fit on the PS1, and you never really think about the limitations that were faced by the programmers, by the artists, by the developers, by the designers, all the stuff that went on. And level design is one of the key elements of Hogs of War. It's the thing that gives it the most character and separates out, especially in single player, separates out each individual level and makes it just that little bit more unique, because at the end of the day, it's the characters, it's the way things are designed and the way things look that gives something more of a theme. And the idea of World War I was played on a lot as well, with certain maps and designs being set in the trenches, being set in different weather types. And you always think of trenches, you think of rainy weather, you think of sludge, and it covered them quite nicely, to the point where there was a good balance between like snowy levels, rainy levels, and just playing on the designs that they'd come up with, and the idea of draw distance is quite a complex thing, given that, like he said, they wanted there to be sniper battles between players or between enemies, and the idea of being able to scope in. I'm guessing it's fairly complicated. I'm not a programmer myself, but when you think about it that way, it does seem a lot more complex. Again, especially when you think about the limitations that were brought across by the PlayStation 1. The limited amount of memory means you have to squash all these things down. Animations, 3D models, sound, levels. Put it all into something that, when you compare it to the size of things today, is absolutely tiny.
Were there any textures of levels that were not used in the final release then? Did it go through a lot of iterations?
Oh, absolutely dozens. I mean, I think if I would attribute the game's final success to anything, it would be that sort of constant iteration that went on. So to give you a bit of background, I mean, we developed the game to a certain stage, but at that point, the game wasn't looking good. The pigs looked quite scary. Nobody liked them. The gameplay wasn't there at all. And it was all a bit hideous. So I mean, at this point, the game really could not have existed. It was looked at by management, and they said, this isn't working, guys. Perhaps we should think about canning the project and doing something else. But the team really believed in the idea, and we said, well, no, give us a little bit longer. We'll strip it down, and we remade the game as what we called Cubes of War. So we took all the graphics out and replaced pigs with boxes and had boxes shooting other boxes across the level. And that gameplay prototype actually demonstrated that the game was fun to play. And we had a separate prototype where we sort of made the pigs look cuter as well. So it was only when we got those two things together that management said, yeah, okay, this has got some legs. But it was about that time that we were being taken over by Infogrames too. So this whole process, the legal process of being taken over by another company, takes ages. So it was actually a great benefit to the project because we kept working, we kept making it better and better. And then eventually when our new French masters came and looked at it, they said, hey, this is really good fun. We like this game.
So that timing really helped then?
It really did, yeah. I mean, it wasn't great for Gremlin to be, the flotation on the stock market going wrong and being subject to a hostile takeover. But for Hogs of War, that actually gave us the extra development time to make it something that actually ultimately succeeded.
So that portion of the interview actually answered some questions I had of my own in regards to at what point did things start to turn around, and what point did things start to change internally with Gremlins and Infogrames, and how did that affect the Hogs of War project as a whole. And as you heard, with the takeover going on, it was that combined with a complete overhaul of the game, just giving the team more time to actually rethink everything and make it fun, I guess, because at the time of, I guess, very early alpha, as you've seen from some of the videos I've made already, the pigs look kind of scary, the gameplay wasn't there, the sound was just non-existent, the levels were kind of there, as you can see that they are fairly similar to some of the levels from today's game, but overall it just wasn't that fun, and it was basically just stripping it down, getting it back to its core concept, and just playing on that and making it as good as it could possibly be. And that then developed into essentially what we know from today, and it's only from that complete turnaround whereby Infogrames came in and gave them a bit more time rather than just completely stopping the project, which thank goodness they didn't. It just gave them enough time. And it's always interesting to see the internal workings of a company, especially when there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in terms of, as he said, a takeover, and how much that affects a project, not just a project, but also like the team as a whole. Does that take away motivation? Does that give more motivation, and it's just great to see that they really capitalized on it and still wanted to focus on it, because it was a great idea. And I don't know about you, but I'm just glad that they didn't let it go.
And I guess when you got it to that level, was it easier to implement stuff like the random generation for levels, which added a lot of life to the game?
Yeah, no, I mean, we got, once people believed in it again, and it was the multiplayer mode, not the single player mode that really got people. We had some executives come from Infogrames and play the game, and we could just hear from outside the room they were laughing themselves stupid. And interesting, the guy that came in and looked at it from Infogrames is a guy called Sean Millard, who is now the creative director at Sumo Digital in Sheffield. But he really loved the game, and we got backing then to carry on and invest more time. But also, they were willing to invest money in marketing, and that's how we led on to getting Rik Mayall involved.
Well, also, kind of having that multiplayer aspect, we've talked to lots of developers, and as soon as that comes into the office, development slows down because everybody's sat there playing the game. Was there a lot of that going on?
There was, but it happened in the evening. So we would create builds during the day, and we would literally go around to Phil Wilson's house and play it until midnight, and then we'd get up the next day, work on the game till the end of the day, and then go around to his house again and play it till the end. So there was just this whole period of just obsessively playing and altering the game and making it better and better. And Phil was pretty ruthless. If a level wasn't working, it was just canned and it got thrown out. So.
And that's always a sign of a good game when you actually want to play it yourselves, I guess.
Yeah, no, and I did enjoy playing it, and it's still fun to a degree. I mean, I think it's quite hard to find TVs these days that you can plug a SCART cable into, where it doesn't look quite grainy. But yeah.
Multiplayer is, of course, a huge aspect of any game, especially in today's era of gaming and the industry as a whole. Multiplayer is seen as a basic stockpile, if you will, of possibilities in terms of creating new levels and all sorts. But not to go down a different rabbit hole, it's interesting to look at Hogs of War from today, in that multiplayer was such a huge thing because stuff like networking wasn't necessarily going to be that big of a problem. As someone who is a QA tester and has gone through multiplayer networking and having to test that kind of thing, it can take a huge amount of time because it is very complicated. With the PS1, I mean, the basis was that if you play multiplayer, you are in the same room as the person you're playing with. So all you need is 2 controllers, or not even that. Sometimes you could use 1 controller. Well, you can use 1 controller in Hogs of War. I'm just going a bit crazy here because, I don't know. It's a lot to kind of think about, and it would have been amazing to test Hogs of War, to be a QA tester and go into work every day and play Hogs of War, because it's my favorite game. It's your favorite game if you're listening to this, I'm guessing, maybe, I don't know. What do you think so far of this podcast, of the interview? I want to know your thoughts on everything that is talked about today in the comments below. As always, we'll get a discussion going. How much do you like multiplayer, and how much do you want the community currently to get online networking multiplayer working? Because that would be awesome to have people playing against people, not have to be in the same room, tie in Discord, live matches, all that kind of crazy stuff. It's possible. We just have to find a way of doing it and getting the word out that it is actually physically possible. From a marketing standpoint, multiplayer is a huge thing, and I think especially in the early years of the late 90s, it was almost an addition to early PlayStation 1 games. It was something that wasn't necessarily unheard of, because PC gaming was taking everything by storm in terms of multiplayer. But when it came to single player, that's where the PS1 tended to shine. So having a functional multiplayer system was a huge bonus to Hogs of War. And as we know, with the addition of generated maps, it just gave players like an infinite possibility of changing the landscape. And that in turn kind of became, just enough for players to keep playing this game. And that's why I think it is still very popular, because I mean, if you think about it, if you didn't have generated maps, how far could this game have gone in terms of popularity? Would it have even been noticed if it didn't even have multiplayer? It raises lots more questions, as always.
Well, you mentioned that Rik Mayall as well was involved. How did that happen then?
So we had a bit of discussion. Once Infogrames were invested in the idea again, they said, well, look, we're really interested in getting some comedians involved. They had some French comedians, whose name I forget, unfortunately. But they wanted them to do the voiceovers for the games. And they said, well, was there an English comedian that we could use for the UK version? I actually wanted Stephen Fry, so that was my first bid. But the marketing people sort of put out messages and they came up with Rik Mayall. So I mean, it was fantastic. We were all in the same Blackadder world, so that was great.
But having like Lord Flashheart involved in the game, that must have been incredible, was it?
No, I mean, he was incredible for the game, and that is often what people sort of remember so fondly about the game is Rik Mayall's quips. But I mean, a lot of voiceover was done by Mark Silk as well, so a professional voiceover artist. But no, it was brilliant to have him in there. I was very disappointed that I didn't actually get to meet him, though. I had a seat in the car to go to the recording where he was doing it, but unfortunately, I was trumped by a marketing executive. Perhaps it's because I voted for Stephen Fry, I don't know.
Well, what about, from the people you did work with, who did work with Rik, how did they describe working with him on the game?
I mean, they said it was brilliant. I was trying to close my ears, but no, I mean, Aid Carlos was, the designer was a big character himself. So I think they probably had a complete riot when they got together.
And he did a lot of voice work on there. So he did the announcer, he did nearly every individual pig's voice as well. Because wasn't each team had 4 pigs and then each one had a different voice?
Yeah, although not all of those are Rik, as I was saying. I think probably he only did half of the pigs. Okay. And the other half, you might think they're Rik, but they're not.
Was he a fan of the game? Was he much of a gamer, do you know?
I don't believe he had played it. This was... gaming wasn't quite as mainstream back then. I think, I'd like to think if he was still with us today, he'd be well into gaming. And big Fortnite fan, I think.
Rik Mayall was awesome, and his voice work was legendary on this game, and it basically contributed to its popularity. But there's this huge misconception that he did all the voices. He didn't, because some of them were done by a guy called Mark Silk, who is a very talented voice actor, and he's the best way I can put him into words is you've heard his voice somewhere, but you just don't know who he is. I don't mean any offense by that. It's just that when I realized some of the cartoon work that he's done, some of the cartoon voices, it was a voice that I recognized, but I didn't realize was him. Sound design is a tricky thing, and I really think that if it wasn't for those 2 wonderful dudes that did all the voice acting for the UK version, or I guess the English version, Hogs of War would not have been anywhere near as popular. When you think of iconic voices, Worms has, the cute little... I'm not going to try and do the voice. I thought about it, but I'm not going to do that. Yeah, it has its iconic default voice that everyone knows, and that's iconic because the gameplay made Worms so popular, and I think less of the voice work contributes to Worms compared to Hogs of War. Hogs of War is way more characteristic. It is still done in Worms by, Worms has different accents, different types of characters, but it will never compare as much to Hogs of War. And if Hogs of War didn't have that, its early voice work was, safe to say, forgettable, I think. It would never have been so impactful on its audience in how much you can relate to those wacky one-liners that Rik pulls out, or those, ridiculous, almost racist, borderline racist sayings that Mark has pulled out as well, so that there's a good equal balance of just good voiceover work and basically building these characters, and I think that's where Worms is slightly detached, because the accents and the voices that are done are really just stereotypes, whereas with these individual voices, you really get a sense of individuality with the characters, even though they're just the same pig model but wearing a different hat. When you think about it in terms of detail, it's pretty awesome.
I mean, was there a plan to do like a sequel at that stage then, or any talks of it? What happened there?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of planned sequels over the years. So we were going to make Hogs of War 2 almost straight afterwards. But surprise, surprise, they found that the game didn't really sell well in America. Basically, they said, well, it's a very quirky British sense of humor. Americans didn't really get it. And at that point, that was a really huge chunk of the console market. So Infogrames didn't feel they could invest in a game that was only going to sell in Europe, even if it sold really well in Europe. So the sequel that was planned by Infogrames was called Hogs of War 2: The Buns of Navarone. And I have the design document. I mean, it was going to be much more character-based. So the idea was it was kind of a bit like Dirty Dozen. So these were kind of pigs that were taken out of prison to perform this kind of death-defying mission. And I think, the designers were really wrestling with this that in the original game you had this sort of leveling up mentality of the pigs. You could promote them through the ranks. You could name them as a grunt and see them go up through the ranks and give them different abilities by taking them in different directions. What the designers wanted with the sequel was more that you'd have a real personality in each character. Thus, the upgrades wouldn't have changed them quite as much, but it allowed them to sort of put kind of characters that would have worked on PlayStation 2, put that much more detail into them. And I think it would have been really interesting to have seen.
So this is perhaps the juiciest bit of news. There has never been... as I've said before, there's barely been any info on the planned sequel except for why it never quite happened. And the fact that we have a title, Hogs of War 2, The Buns of Navarone, I'm pretty sure he said buns. He might have said guns, but it sounded like buns. If that's the case, who came up with this name? Because, it's kind of catchy, but it's a bit weird, if you ask me. But the concept of having characters, like he said, that are basically made up of criminals, it essentially sounds like Suicide Squad, but Hogs of War, where they're made to do tasks. I think that was this kind of storyline that was done in the most recent Ace Combat 7. I played that, completed it, and yeah, you're kind of the bad guy. Not really the bad guy, you're the innocent bad guy, who kind of joins this merry band of other criminals, and you're made to do the dirty work of things. And as he said, with the idea of upgrades would assist but wouldn't necessarily change the characters too much, means that the characters were completely characteristic in themselves, in that they each had their own specific personality, kind of the same of what we've seen, but when you have the power of the PS2 compared to the PS1, you can add more detail in design, in voice work, in animations, and really step up the game of the software that you can use to enhance the detail of said characters. And yeah, so I think the upgrades would play more of upgrading weapons, maybe. It's all speculation, obviously, and the concept is pretty cool. I don't think I would have been as engaged with it as I was with the first one, because obviously Hogs of War plays on the theme of World War I. That's something I've always been interested in from a historical point of view. So, yeah. The other reasoning he gave as to why it never came to be that there would be a Hogs of War 2 was because of marketing, and they found that it wasn't really going to do very well. The American market just wasn't interested. And as someone who is in the industry, I can safely say that if you have a game that isn't really popular and isn't going to sell very well in the States, it's not really going to do very well. And that is usually either canned or completely, restructured and rethought out and completely revamped to basically cater for an American audience, because you'll find that there are major differences between the American market and the European market in what they're looking for. You'll find that the American US States market is looking for fast-paced, low attention span kind of thing. There is, it's very much a stereotype, but it's true when it comes to games and basically what different audiences want. It doesn't necessarily speak for the whole community or communities of different types of games. This is just from a marketing standpoint. I don't know. There's a lot of differences between European and American, and usually the American market outweighs the European. So it's unfortunate, and it's an interesting, again, insight into why it didn't happen, rather than just Infogrames went out of business or they didn't have the money, because in this case they did. There was an opportunity, but things weren't going well, and unfortunately it had to be canned, which is a shame.
But bizarrely, it's not been until this year that a group of students have actually completely taken the game apart. So they've managed to get the level format working, and they've actually got it running on a PlayStation 4. So they've got the original PlayStation 1 code all running on the PlayStation 4. They're starting to write a renderer working for it, and if they can get the kind of pig animation working, then we would actually have a version that would work. At the moment, it's just a student project, but it's looking very promising. You forget the PlayStation 1 architecture had no floating point, and to take that to a sort of 64-bit modern architecture is actually quite a challenge, and many things break, particularly when you're taking code that was written by young people themselves back 20 years ago.
So to finish off then, from the community standpoint, it is quite encouraging to see that there are a group of students who are working on a project to do with Hogs of War and being able to get it to run on PS4. But what I don't want is for people to get ridiculously excited by this and think that there's going to be a release or a remake, because Hogs of War is big, complicated, and ridiculously complicated. It will break a lot, especially if you remove stuff, if you try and alter stuff. It doesn't like being touched. It likes being left alone. Take it from someone who's tried to mod it and has been talking to people that know what they're talking about when it comes to programming. It's a difficult thing to do, but it's also very encouraging, and all props to them, and I hope that they can get it up and running and release content or just some kind of visual stuff, video, whatnot on YouTube very soon. I hope that they can and that they do, because the rest of us would love to see it. But overall, that is going to wrap up this episode of this podcast. I hope you guys have enjoyed. Much longer than my usual videos, and I think my longest podcast so far, which is awesome to see. But I'd love to know what you think. As I said before, let me know in the comments about everything Jacob said, everything we've talked about, and any additional thoughts that you have. And if you want to come join us in the Hogs of War Discord, feel free to. The link to it is in the description below, as always. I hope you can, so we can keep growing this community. And in the meantime, I will catch you guys later for the next episode.
Destination going.